Good evening, everyone. My name is Jessica Yen. I'm the Assistant Dean of Summer Sessions and Visiting Student Programs here at Columbia University School of Professional Studies. It is my pleasure to welcome you tonight to the capstone of our Columbia Summer Experience program and introduce you to tonight's speakers. As you may know, Columbia University is a remarkable community full of scholars, researchers, students whose work covers every corner of the globe and across multiple disciplines. The Columbia Summer Experience provides a special opportunity to connect with our senior faculty, their research, and share the implications of it with our community. From exploring the last 100 years of Black music to discussing Darwin and dinosaurs, we have loved exploring these topics through your eyes and lines of inquiry. To learn more about our summer programs, I would encourage you to visit our website at summer.sps.columbia.edu. This summer, we are extremely grateful to have partnered with Karen Green. She is the curator of comics and cartoons at the Butler Rare Book and Manuscript Library and lecturer in English and comparative literature. Karen Green has provided special access to this remarkable collection of graphic novels and comics, from giving private tours of the collection to hosting conversations about special publications and introducing movie screenings. This evening, she will lead the conversation, Comics and Graphic Novels, America's Most Influential Medium, with Professors Jeremy Dauber and Aubrey Gabel. Professor Dauber is the Director of Undergraduate Studies for Yiddish, Atran Professor of Yiddish Language, Literature, and Culture, and the Director Emeritus of the Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies. He teaches courses in a wide variety of topics, from the American graphic novel to readings in Jewish literature, humor, and modern Jewish literature. Professor Gabel is the Director of Undergraduate Studies at Columbia's Department of French. She is an assistant professor of French and specializes in 20th and 21st century French and Francophone literature, culture, and visual media. She teaches a French lecture series course and the course Post-War French Cinema and Bad Taste. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming our speakers for tonight's conversation, Comics and Graphic Novels, America's Most Influential Medium.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and thank you to the School of Professional Studies for choosing my course to build this summer programming around, and thank you all for coming tonight. So we're going to get right into it by addressing the rather controversial statement of the title of this talk. Aubrey, Jeremy, are comics America's most influential medium? And if so, why? And if not, why not?
I think Jeremy should start us off.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Okay, I think the reason that everyone is looking at me is because I suggested this as a point of pique or mischief in our conversations about this, so I'm the one who's responsible to it. I would just say a couple of things very quickly, and then we can sort of open it up for discussion about them. Right. One is that I wrote this history of American comics, available at bookstores anywhere. And one of the things that I found was in the age of the great age of newspapers, right, where everybody was reading a newspaper, what everyone was doing, children, grown-ups, presidents, everybody were reading the comic strips day after day to find out what was happening next. When you had sociologists from other countries, and they said, this is what you need to do to understand the United States, they said, read the comics pages of the newspapers, right? Comic books were a medium that was so huge in the 1950s that they, in terms of actual sales, they outweighed the books that were in public libraries 10 to 1, right? And now, all you need to do is look at the multiplex, and you can see, or the television screen, you can just see that basically everything is predicated on comics with the side of Barbie, it seems like. So I think that when we talk about sort of mass reach and impact, this medium, whether it's comic strips in the newspapers or comic books or comic characters that have become sort of transplanted into other media, right, really just has a reach that it's very hard to argue almost any other medium does. So that's my opening statement, and now we can sort of argue about it for however long we want to.
Rebuttal? Agreement?
I think I'm in agreement. I mean, I think it's really interesting to think about it as a particular instance of the rise of print culture in the late 19th century in France. Kind of proto-comics, forms that look like comics but aren't comics, that are produced in a newspaper form, are also incredibly popular, and also happen a lot earlier than you think they do. We talk about in France and in French language instances of bande dessinée, the drawn strip is the translation into English, that date back to seeing them in newspapers in 1845, for the example of the Swiss artist Rodolphe Töpfer. But I think it's also really interesting to think about the ways in which comics have been influential in history and in mass culture's relationship to history. The numerous examples that we could come up with different kinds of propaganda comics as a form of propaganda. Some of the earliest Tintin comics were published in, more conservative, further right Catholic newspapers, right? Catholic news supplements that were aimed at children. And so while there's much to be said about a figure like Hergé and his life and the way that his art form changes in tandem with changes in the medium, he also, was part of a certain kind of propaganda venue that was targeting children. And I think superhero comics during World War II, Disney comics in France during World War II, we can come up with lots of examples of the ways that comics were integrated into larger historical crises and instances of war. But I think the other thing that I think the nod towards cinema is useful here, because I think we forget the extent to which comics hover in the background of our visual landscape. And it's hard not to think of of a filmmaker like Luc Besson without thinking of heavy metal, Métal Hurlant, the way that the adult comics scene has its hand in the visual culture of contemporary French media. And in fact, French New Wave, for instance, is filled with references to comics. And it's not the kind of thing that you think of as the primary sort of thrust of that filmic era, but nevertheless something that is always present and always in the background.
Yeah.
It's funny because when I first saw this title, I thought, really? Because people who read comics and people who make comics have been so marginalized for so long, especially since the bad old days of the Comics Code, the instigation of the Comics Code. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought, somebody actually just mentioned the other day that you're still seeing like 20-something people wearing Charlie Brown t-shirts, and Peanuts hasn't even run in the newspapers for how many decades now. Maybe they see the holiday specials on television, but
do they have televisions?
Yeah, exactly, on streaming. But I think the point about the takeover of the media, of the movie and television industry is a completely valid one. I think also the recognition at a more intelligentsia level, where we've got 5 cartoonists now who've won MacArthur Genius Awards. We have graphic novels that have won the National Book Award. We still have, middle school teachers saying, you can't read a graphic novel for your book report. That's not a real book. But those people are dying off.
I mean, when I was growing up, when I was a kid, if you had asked me what my definition of heaven would be, because I was a nerd, my definition would have been, I could go to my public library and find comic books. Or I could go to school and talk about comic books. You're seeing a theme. And that is really the situation. You fast forward a couple of decades, and that is the situation that we're in now. And it is just amazing, but we also have this sense that you're saying, I mean, we weren't talking about this as America's most prestigious medium or America's most cachet-filled medium, right? That is not, and it's very common when you talk about the history of mass culture that it's all the stuff that is marginalized. It's all the stuff that, you know, that really, you know, is deeply, deeply powerful, gets in people's heads in that way. So I think that part of that is what we're talking about. I just wanted to get back to something, Aubrey, that you were saying, right, which is about politics, which I thought was really important, right, which is one of the things that I think people who study this stuff find the most annoying, but maybe my colleagues will disagree, is when people say, well, comics are so political now.
Oh,
right?
Jesus.
Yeah, there you go. Comics are so political. Comics have always been, as Aubrey was saying, embroiled in politics from the very, very beginning. They're always taking a stand on something. And very often, not just in the way that we academics like to find political meanings, but explicitly. Overtly and explicitly. And in that sense, if you have a choice between someone getting involved and taking a stand on being active in fighting Nazis, let's say, and it reaches millions and millions of people, or a novel that reaches, you know, a couple of 10,000s of people, I know which one I'd rather have my message in, right?
Right.
So,
I mean, the very first issue of Captain America in 1941,
100%.
before we were even in the war, before Pearl Harbor,
Yeah.
shows Captain America punching out Hitler.
Yeah.
And he does the same thing on the cover of #2 as well, which is a reproduction of which is on display in the Rare Book and Manuscript Library even as we speak.
nice.
So from, you know, Superman in Action 1 taking on like domestic abuse and gun runners and political corruption to Stan's soapbox, to those great DC Comics PSAs in which Superman is talking to a nice ethnic rainbow of children saying, inclusion is American and exclusion is un-American. I mean, politics have always been absolutely explicit
100%.
in comics. So I don't know how many of you know this phenomenon known as Comicsgate, in which some rather conservative comics creators and comics fans have derided and bemoaned the social justice warriors of today's comics. It's like, what comics did they grow up on?
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I already, you know, I wanted to get back to something else that you were saying. Maybe here we have to say this too. But you know, when we came up with the title, we were really talking about America, and it's influential. But as you're pointing out, you know, there's all this sort of back and forth, and there's sort of more local traditions in other countries as well, particularly France. You know, what ways is America's influential medium influencing other countries, and particularly, you know, countries with strong traditions of comics too?
Yeah. I mean, I think in a lot of ways to think of France and Belgium, because when we're talking about French comics, those are really the two main places where there are big publishers of comics. And there are certainly more indie houses throughout the world, you know, Algeria, Canada, you know, all kinds of, all throughout North Africa. But predominantly when we're thinking about bande dessinée, we're thinking about Belgium and France. And I think it can be really interesting in a lot of ways, as a counterpoint is what I was trying to say, is because in some ways there isn't the same kind of legal history. It seems to be more one rooted around self-censorship than active censorship, but there are exceptions to that. The predecessor to Charlie Hebdo was censored, and that was its conclusion. But there are lots of examples of it being a medium that perhaps, I don't know, was it's agreed that it was widely read by adults and children, and in many ways, you know, when you talk about a generation of authors because my first specialization is in French literature and experimental literature, to say to, you know, people that were born in the 30s and 40s, do you think comics are important? Do you read comics? Yeah, of course they do. You know, it's part of their coming of age, the history of that generation, and it's aligned with things like cinema. But I think it's also interesting to think about some of these kinds of international networks of comic circulation, because I think the narrative of, you know, DC, Marvel, superhero comics made it everywhere and touched every part of the globe. That's definitely one part of the story, but one of the things that I find more interesting when I become sort of more enmeshed in the history and the scholarship is these kinds of nodes of transmission, to think about, comics, French artists that moved to New York,
Right.
and start to meet Art Spiegelman, Françoise Mouly, his wife.
Or bringing Harvey Kurtzman to Angoulême.
Totally, and so there's a kind of back and forth between the French language and American scene, but that is often sometimes routed through Canada. So you get a figure like Julie Doucet, who's who was important to the independent, to the indie publisher scene in both France and the U.S.
Absolutely.
And in some ways is a kind of interesting figure for someone who had an international career. And that's really the only way of thinking about her. But then also has a very Canadian Quebec, her French is very Quebecois. It has a very Canadian specificity that is often lost on American readers because it's read in translation.
Sure.
Marde, instead of merde, like the kind of the swear words that have a different tone to the vowel, that kind of thing.
So all three of us teach courses that involve comics. I know that one of the things that I like to say about the kind of the justification of teaching comics is that we live in an increasingly visually literate world. We communicate with emojis. We put together our IKEA Billy bookcases with visual cartoon instructions. But above and beyond that, what do you see as the significance or the relevance of teaching comics in an academic setting?
Well, you may have heard that comics is America's most influential medium. So that, largely speaking, is my justification for teaching it in America. I think that if, to the extent that we are both cultural historians and literary critics, it is very interesting first to see how it has worked its way through, in my case, 150 years or so of American history. And also, it poses, as a literary, wearing my literary critic hat, a very, very interesting set of questions that I think we can all talk about in different ways, about how we read, what we think about when we read these things, how we put things together in our heads, and what kind of ways that's different from a lot of other kinds of literature that we teach. So from the aesthetic and literary side, that's interesting. And of course, you can see the work of tremendous craft and technique, and that is a set of questions. But also combining that in the courses that I teach with how that fits into these sort of larger historical and cultural narratives. That combination is what I do. But in some sense, I often feel that justification is a kind of mug's game, as we used to say. That you're being more on the defensive. I teach it because that's what it is. And you don't need to be apologetic for it. So that's sort of where I stand on it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think there's also a kind of a generational gap in some ways, because I think I'm benefiting from teaching these courses at a moment at which it's more or less accepted among academics that you can teach classes on graphic novels and comics and comic history, proto-comic forms. Again, in the French context, there's a specialist at the Collège de France, the largest most famous intellectual institution that exists in France. So in some ways, that's the height of consecration, right? That's the height of you have been accepted into the academy. So in some ways, I don't actually have to make a case for it because, they got a guy in the right place, right?
So we're not justifying anything. I think.
We are unashamed.
We're unashamed.
Proud and unashamed.
Yeah.
But I will say that I think talking to, you see a divide between scholars that are interested in mass culture, mass media culture, and literary scholars. And sometimes literary scholars are the ones that are resistant, where there is a kind of ethos of, well, Maus is great, but, Maus, we all accept that there are certain people that we can teach.
Later.
We can all teach Art Spiegelman, but are there other things where I'm a little more on the fence? And I think in those cases, I also don't argue with those people. It's not, it's not a good use of my time. But I think one of the things that I appreciate more as I spend more time with people that came up as comic scholars are the things that have to do with the formal specificity of the medium. Yeah. What does it mean to have a story that's narrated visually and textually? What does it mean to have a story that's sequential in a particular order, that plays with gaps in temporality, that has a controlled frame, all of the things about comics that someone who can appreciate, a big figure as they've risen and been canonized might be missing about the specificity of the visual aspect of the medium. And I think one of the things that's particularly incredible is, again, to think about it in terms of this dialogue between visual and textual, and how there's something unique about that way of telling a story that doesn't get fully, hasn't been fully absorbed into other kinds of critical spheres.
It's
in scholarship around art and film. And
it's interesting to see kind of the evolution of reviews in American cultural media, whether it's the New York Times, New York Review of Books, the New Yorker, a lot of New York-centric stuff there. But it used to be just about like the story, and they would never talk about the art. And it would be very frustrating. They'd never talk about the effectiveness of the art or the style of the art or the artistic influences on the art. And it's beginning to change now. Now you're getting folks like Hilary Chute and Douglas Wolk writing reviews, and they're very conscious of the visual nature of this medium. But the fact that so many comics courses are situated in literature departments. They come out of English Lit, they come out of the French department, they come out of American Studies is actually progress, but it's still very grounded in a literary approach that needs to evolve because it's not simply a literary medium.
And I would say to the people, some of you seem to be students, that this is why you can take multiple courses on this, or indeed on anything. That if Aubrey and I and Karen, you went to each of our classes and we did the same, that you might actually have 3 very different approaches to looking at the same work.
Which is an amazing segue to my next question.
I hoped it would be.
So, as Jeremy says, the 3 of us teach and we take very different approaches. My course is about learning how to read comics, understanding how the tools that are in the creator's toolkits, the page layout, panel composition, color, speech balloon shape and size and placement, lettering, special effects, etc. How does this propel the narrative? So it's very kind of like a close reading in that sense that is very different from your approach. Could you talk about yours?
Yeah, I think Jeremy and I might have some overlap here, but I tend to, I teach a course, for instance, called Violence, Politics, and the Graphic Novel, which is to a certain extent about the history of the medium, but the history of the medium in French language sources. So looking back to very early examples of sequential art that was produced as a reaction to wartime. So something like Jacques Callot has a series called Les Misères de la Guerre, the Miseries of Warfare, the Miseries of War, I think the English title, but that is about the 100 Years' War and is sequential, does have frames, looks a little bit like comics, is hundreds of years before comics exist.
Yeah.
And so I'm interested in some aspects of that where it's about the history of the medium when I teach these courses, but also that question, I guess I do address it ultimately, of why this would be a medium to write about certain kinds of stories. Why would you write about the Vietnamese diaspora after various forms of French colonialism? Why would you choose to write about that in comics? Like is the case for someone like Clément Balou. Why write about a series of wars? Jacques Tardy writes about the French Commune, World War I, World War II. I think he also has a book on France in the 1960s around May 68. But at any rate, why would you choose this particular medium to tell these stories that are actually quite painful, and that in some cases are personal narratives, and some cases aren't, and in some cases aren't narrative, because the experimental scholar in me is also, interested in poetic forms, non-narrative forms, suites of images that tell stories without being necessarily servicing a larger arc. But I think one thing that that we have a lot of at Columbia, I know people teach in other departments, that's an interesting way of approaching it as well, is to be thinking about the progressive way in which, especially right now, comics has made its way into other subfields.
Yes.
So comics journalism, has a very strong impulse in France. There's lots of writing about various kinds of ecological issues in journalistic form. There are newspapers that exist that are exclusively comics journalism newspapers, that is the way that they narrate, especially narrative journalism or sort of long form journalist stories, but that came out and existed in that form. And then things like graphic medicine are a really interesting kind of crossover. So why has this, in some ways, a very sort of academic subfield coalesced around people that tell their stories through this, a lot of personal narratives around illness, personal narratives around body dysmorphia, what it's like to be a doctor, gender, et cetera. So there's really interesting examples of the way that has developed as a discipline, and then it has actually become a subfield that in medicine that people are developing and using in particular ways, but that embodies all kinds of things. So I just had a long article come out about abortion comics, and what does it mean to produce comics in France and the US, that this would be the form that would be chosen to write about abortion, where the context is, of course, is radically different, whether you're talking about it in a place where it's progressively becoming illegal, or, and it's quite variable based on regional questions, versus in the French context, a lot of these comics are largely memorial. They're about a past generation of activism that is being highlighted and showcased, but it's not as much a contemporary debate. So, what other fields does it make its way into?
I just want to say, to respond to part of that, in the notion of graphics journalism and the use of this medium to tell extremely serious stories. If you go into Butler Library, to the third floor where the circulation desk is, on either side there are these massive wood and glass cases, and I worked with some colleagues in the Global Studies department to create a little exhibition on global displacement in comics. So Sudanese refugees, Syrian refugees, Latin American, Central American refugees. And when the committee that was working on this first sat down, one of my colleagues is like, why would anybody do comics about this? These aren't funny stories.
Yeah.
And he came out on the other side a little better educated about how comics tell stories, that they can tell stories that are profound and tragic and serious and important. They're not just guys in capes and tights.
And then just to follow up on that rely on certain kind of visual histories of caricature, of different kinds of hand-drawn artistry, of high art, et cetera, that can rely on a variety of different kinds of visual forms in order to tell these narratives without just being flat or caricature.
Right. So, your approach, sir?
Well, I think that it becomes very interesting because what we're talking about in some ways is how we're teaching a set of courses, by and large, which are already constrained by a very particular choice, which is to make comics in the first place. So most of the people, that's another way maybe of thinking about this, is that most of the people who are making these comics are making comics because that's what they do. Right. They make comics, right? If they were filmmakers, they'd make film, but they're comic makers, so they make comics. And so you can either track, in using comics, the history of the medium, either writ large or on a particular subject, or you can ask a particular question, in which case comics may be part of the answer, but not the whole answer. So if I were looking at popular, just as an example, if I were looking at popular expressions of attitudes towards labor during the Great Depression, I would almost certainly suggest to a graduate student or an undergraduate that they look at Little Orphan Annie, right? But I would not suggest to them that they only look at Little Orphan Annie, right? I would suggest they look at a wide variety of things in a wide variety of media, including Little Orphan Annie, right? So it's a different set of questions, and depending on that, you're also, and this is more my approach, thinking of a conjunction between individual players, their biography, the institutions, and here I mean the institutions of the medium in which they are in, and the outside influences, both historical and literary, right? But never losing track of the fact that there are these larger pressures on why they are doing these things, right? You could do all of the comics journalism in the world that you do, and if there are not venues to produce them, then you are not really very able to reach a large audience whatsoever, right? Conversely, if there are media, so for example, many years ago, and I think Karen, you were instrumentally involved in this, John Lewis, the congressman, the civil rights leader, came to Columbia to talk about this wonderful version, graphic novel version of his life story, March. The only reason that he agreed, there are two reasons I should say why he agreed to do March as a comic book, or a graphic novel, perhaps I should say. The first of them was because as a kid, he read a comic book about civil rights.
About Martin Luther King.
About Martin Luther King, and that inspired him to get involved in the movement, which is amazing, right? That presumes a whole level of institutional allowance for that kind of comic book, which we can get into. The second, of course, is that graphic novels, by the time he did this in 2007, had reached a sufficiently high status that it was worth very distinguished Congressman John Lewis' time in order to do it, right? And part of the story of March is, the way I would teach it, about those two things.
Yeah.
Right. And so that is more of the approach that I take. But as you can see, there are widely different approaches, and they all have tremendous merit to them. And it's just sort of, you pays your money and you take your choice, so to speak.
You know, your point about these are cartoonists and this is how they tell their stories makes me think, so Bill Griffith, brilliant cartoonist,
Right.
creator of Zippy the Pinhead, starting about 8 years ago, he started doing a series of graphic novels. Married to Diane Newman, prominent underground cartoonist who, with Aileen Kaminsky-Crumb, split off from the Women's Comics Collective in San Francisco and founded Twisted Sisters, an anthology that was not perhaps as doctrinaire as women's comics was becoming. So Diane Newman, remarkable woman, died September 1st of last year, and Bill was destroyed by this, absolutely destroyed by this. He was finishing up a graphic novel that's just coming out now about Ernie Bushmiller, the creator of Nancy. But while he was waiting for this book, Three Rocks, to come out, and while he was processing his grief, he created a comic about Diane, about their life together, about his sense of loss, his grief, about what made her so special. And it's tragic and it's hilarious. It's called The Buildings Are Barking, which is something she said in her sleep one night. And it came out, like, the turnaround was phenomenal. He finished it, Fantagraphics published it, it's in stores now. And this is how he processed his grief, because he is a cartoonist.
Right, that's right. And I think that's right. I mean, I think, if he were a librettist,
right,
he would do something else, right? He would write an opera. And I always try and keep, I know we have I always try and keep that in mind of what are the decisions, because I'm in some ways as much of a cultural historian as I am a literary critic. What are the ways in which the choices are available to the people at the particular moment that they're making these choices? If you are a Jew in the early to mid 1930s, and you love comics and you want to make comics, the strip world, the comic newspaper world, is largely speaking not available to you, right? And so you go into a second-rate business like packaging this and making comic books. And that is the set of choices that are available to you. And it's hard to understand Superman without understanding that in mind. And then Superman changes everything again and opens it up, right? So, but we need to move on, I suspect.
Yeah, I think so. We have a series of images. This isn't going to be a "Can you guess this?" I might even just say what it is, but we're going to put up a series of images.
We have not seen these.
They
Karen
have not
has
seen them. I chose
them.
them. They are both American and French, or Franco-Belgian, and I'd like you to talk about how you would teach them. So you must recognize this.
I do. Yes.
Do you recognize this? This is page 1. Yes, page 1 of a 6-page comic that ran in Raw in the 1980s by Richard McGuire. It's called Here. Okay, so take it away.
I will go first because this betrays everything that I have just said. Or almost everything that I've just said. Because by and large, this comic here, as you were saying, this Richard McGuire comic, while you can put it in a particular historical moment of increasing interest and venue in Raw and other things like that, of a kind of avant-garde ability to sort of push the forward, and I would talk about it in that way, it is perhaps the most formally brilliant and expressive comic maybe ever produced in America.
I think so.
And what it does is you can kind of see the dates here, but you can see it's basically in the same physical spot, right? But the inset panels are at different times, 1999, 1957, 1971, and it just gets more and more ambitious as the story goes on, and you are just taken, your breath is taken away by the capacity of what you can do. Aubrey was talking about this a lot, with time and space shoehorned together in a kind of visual shorthand that is impossible even in other visual media like film. So that's all I'm going to say about that, because I want to give other people the chance to talk about it too.
Yeah. I mean, I think these questions of I mean, comics theorists like to talk a lot about what do comics do with time, but a lot of times the instance that is particularly discussed is the idea of sequence. So the idea that you can see a period of time as it's happening.
Right.
But this is an interesting example because of the question of simultaneity, right? And what does it mean to narrate different things at the same time? But definitely, I would also talk about the avant-garde mode, because setting everything in a single room, I can think of other comics that use this for political reasons. Guy Delisle has an adaptation of a memoir about an individual who was kidnapped while he was working for Doctors Without Borders.
Oh, wow.
And it's all set, it's called Hostage, and it's all set in one room because he was in one room.
That's where he was, yeah.
Yeah, and so there's a kind of experimental ethos to it, but that has a purpose in the memoir and the narrative that he's retelling.
Yeah, and I talk about this as comics being a medium of time. Oh my God, we only have 5 minutes left and we've got 6 images to go. I talk about this as being an example of, like the ultimate example of comics as a medium of time, because this is one point in space, the corner of Richard McGuire's childhood home, over an almost infinite span of time, from lava in 1 million years BC into the future. So,
yeah, this is a really interesting. So this is Jacques Tardy, one of his novels about. He has a 2-volume series that's about World War I.
this is Goddamn This War.
Okay, Putain de Guerre. And this is a really interesting volume. I mean, but the series is really interesting because it plays with color and black and white, and different volumes have different kind of ethoses. And one volume really insists on the use of color and of quotes from the time period. We'll sort of have a quote from Maréchal de Pétain talking about, Vichy France, and then have that image, an image of kind of horrific violence that's happening at the same time. When I taught Tardy last, I did teach Goya, just randomly for my own purposes in the class, because I do feel like a lot of comic artists are thinking about Goya. And the disasters of war is in the background here for me, because you see a tree, you see a kind of horrific violence, you have the play between the caption, which functions like a kind of subtitle, there's a kind of sardonic or satirical humor. But the other thing that Tardy does that's really interesting that we see some of here, talking about he's writing from the soldier's perspective, writing the experience of a soldier. One of the volumes is from one person's point of view the whole way through, the other is more anonymous but looks from the soldier's perspective the whole time. But these images are, these various kinds of disfiguration that come out of chemical warfare, trench warfare, early chemical warfare, trench warfare, are actually paired with photographic evidence of the period too. So the very end of the volume looks at images, not as much images of disfiguration, but when you talk about the French context in particular, there was such a, the lost generation is an expression we've heard, but there was such a large generation of young men that died or disfigured or had horrible memory loss, et cetera, that this kind of visual artistic rendering of the many ways in which people are kind of physically and emotionally impacted by the war is very striking. But yeah, there's a dialogue with photograph is also something that's really interesting, and a
with art,
strategy
with George Grosz or Otto Dix or any of those artists of that time period who are also capturing these disfigured men.
Totally. Yeah, and I think for Tardy in particular, talking about someone who came of age in the adult comics scene. So that some of these comics were originally published in, I think, in A Suivre, which was a adult comics magazine of the time. So again, someone who's doing certain kinds of experimentalism, but that was able to publish because of the way that there was already an adult scene, and then that kind of allowed there to eventually be graphic novels that we're reading now.
Yeah. I'll just say, I think, Aubrey has said really just tremendous things about this. I'll just say today, I know you're all thinking, boy, I'm going to go and buy Jeremy's History of American Comics. What's his next book? The next book I'm writing is a history of American horror. And it's interesting how much, you talked about photography, but also how much this is about film. If you look at 1920s horror movies, particularly Lon Chaney's things, right, these visuals haunt the horrific imagination of that period, right? So all of that sort of disfigurement. So that's this kind of aspect of it. Tardy becomes one of the first figures that Francois Mouly and Art Spiegelman bring to America in Raw. So that's that American connection. But that's really all we have time for now, I think.
So these are 2 pages from a rather famous book, and I will say that I was on a panel at Comic-Con a week and a half ago about the fact that Norton's Critical Editions has produced their first critical edition of a graphic novel. And it's A Contract with God. And these are 2 different pages, page 22 and page 65, that I often have my students look at because of the contrast in the visual and what it says about looking backward, looking forward, candlelight, electric light, the past, the present, and the future. And I know you talk quite a bit about Eisner, so maybe you can take...
I am actually in the Norton Critical Edition. I don't know if
you are. You have an essay. I read it.
Because I am a loser. This was a dream of mine to be in a Norton Critical Edition, so I was very happy to find it.
Loser.
But I think that, you're absolutely, that this is, it's sort of like the Holy Roman Empire, and it's not really a graphic novel, right? It's a collection of stories.
It's a story cycle.
It's a story...
Story cycle.
A story cycle. Yeah, we can call it a story cycle. Yeah. And I think, one of the things here is that Eisner, this is a very conventional sort of statement about it, but I think it's right, that Eisner really is, we've been talking about the autobiographical turn, and a lot of people are doing it before Eisner, some of the people that have been mentioned already here, but because Eisner in many ways was kind of the grand old figure of comics, when he does it, and he does it in a way that puts it, or tries to put it, not very successfully, into bookstores, that sort of makes a kind of statement. And it's also a way, as you heard sort of early on, I work a lot on Jewish studies as well, this was a way of Eisner connecting with his own autobiographical Jewish past in a way that really did not mark a lot of the history of popular comics up to that point. When Jews became involved in the comic book industry, there was a lot of ethnic effacement, a lot of saying, okay, we're going to create characters, and they're going to be people with names like Bruce Wayne or Clark Kent, right? These are, classically Jewish names, as you can imagine.
Jews did the same thing in Hollywood.
And Jews did the same thing in Hollywood, right? This is all part of this. And I think, right,
secular.
Here, Will Eisner, this guy who is sort of this monumental figure in mainstream comics, is saying, what my project is going to be is to turn to the Lower East Side and to turn to Jewish roots.
Bronx.
I'm sorry, Bronx roots. You're right, of course, Bronx roots. Thank you. And is writing a kind of Jewish fable, let's call it.
Absolutely.
So I think that, yeah.
Denise, we've gone so far past the 5 minutes, and we still have more images. Should we go on, or should we go open up to questions? What do you think? Should we open up to questions, or do you want to see the rest of the images? Images, okay, here we go. Do you recognize this?
Is this the Schwitten that
Yeah.
you're talking about? Okay.
Yeah.
You tell me, actually, because you know more about his work than I do. Yeah.
So I discovered Benoit Peters, the writer, and Francois Schwitten, if you're in France, or Schouten, if you're in Belgium, where he's from, in the pages of heavy metal back in the 1980s, and fell in love, in love, in love. And this is the bottom half of a page from a book of theirs called The Leaning Girl, which is part of a series called The Obscure Cities. And Mary Van Rathen is a girl who something happens to her and she cannot stand upright. She only leans. But Schwitten's or Schouten's art is so formally elegant. His architectural renderings are stunning. His parents were architects. He's very fascinated with architecture. He helped restore an Art Nouveau villa in Brussels. He designed the metro station for the Arts et Métiers metro stop, that steampunk one. He designed it. So this, to me, is just an example of how beautiful comics can be. Just freaking beautiful.
What's also amazing to me is that, you know, when you make comics, like when you make anything almost artistic, you start with a white page.
Yes.
And so what you have here is, in some sense, almost an inverted thing, right? Where you create, you know,
His art is the negative space.
his art is the negative space. So that's exactly well put.
Yeah.
You know, yeah. So that, I think, is this incredible aspect of these images that I have not seen before. But it's just incredible how the white works, so the negative space.
And I will say, if you read the English edition of Leaning Girl in Butler Library, I wrote the introduction.
Nice. So you had seen these before?
So I had seen these before, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think just on the level of artistry too, that something that's incredible about comics that you can see, even if in this kind of blown up image, is that these are all strokes, right? Like these are all individual line strokes, and I think sometimes we reserve some of those observations for painting and for high art, but in fact to realize that there's someone that ticked in this entire backdrop to this scene is a really incredible, the hand of the artist is incredibly visible, and to think about what it means to be looking at hand-drawn art and the amount of labor that goes into it.
Yeah.
Worth looking
really
at
worth
the
appreciating.
artist editions in the graphic novels collection, which are massive volumes that reproduce original art at insanely high resolution, actual size. So you can see the hand of the artist, you can see the whiteout of the artist, you can see the marginalia of the artist as he's talking to the writer and the editor in kind of a back and forth. It's as close as you'll get to having your own library of original art. Do you know what this is from?
I don't know that I do, no.
I teach this book almost every year. So this is Ronald Wimberly's Prince of Cats.
Oh, okay. So then okay.
It is a
I didn't recognize it.
1980s Brooklyn hip-hop retelling of Romeo and Juliet with Tybalt as the main character, who is referred to as Prince of Cats in Shakespeare,
Yeah.
and which uses a lot of Shakespeare's original dialogue. And I usually teach it in the class session where I focus on color, because his use of color, it's a little washed out because of the light here. This is an extraordinarily beautiful book that kind of screams 1980s colors, and the way he uses his lettering is
Right,
extraordinary. The way he has these little inset panels that focus on kind of moments and spots. That's what I do, but there's a million ways to approach this book.
We tend to talk about it, and quite rightly, comics as a visual medium, but it is the most sonic of all visual media because of all, everyone knows the sound effects, right? All of the, right? And as you say, Wimberly, I didn't recognize, but as you say, Wimberly is just phenomenal at sort of giving a soundtrack because it really is trying to give us a sense of the musicality of what is, after all, a play with poetry that is so musical. And he really wants to give us that sense of it too. So I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah. Well, totally. And if you didn't catch it on the last page, there's also sound effects too.
Yes.
That are
Yes,
very,
a
there's
little
a little hidden in the bottom of the frame.
Absolutely. Okay, content warning for the next slide. It is from a graphic novel that is now banned in some countries. It's a part of a famous series, but it is a reflection of its time.
So this is Tintin Congo, Tintin in the Congo, and it originally was published in a children's supplement. So it became a comic book eventually. And this is an interesting one, and it is one that I teach because I think it's important to think about the kinds of cultural heritage that a figure like Hergé, the creator of the Tintin series, Georges Prosper Rémy, an iconic figure, a series that if there is a French series you probably know Tintin or Astérix, but you probably don't know a lot about the long history of the various kinds of texts that he produced. And there's a scholar, Mark McKinney. There's a lot of scholarship about Hergé, actually, because he's one of the figures. Peters has a book about him.
Yes, absolutely.
So he's one of the kind of big figures that allowed comics to become a medium that was respected in France. But he's also a tricky one, right? Because of the ways that he's involved in various kinds of Catholic pro-colonial propaganda. Someone whose political histories and political affiliations will change quite radically over the course of his time, but in a way that doesn't excuse or justify the ways that he was enmeshed in certain kinds of French, and in this case, Belgian colonial propaganda. So this is an interesting one to be thinking about what was the kind of visual code of colonization, and what were the kinds of figures that were produced, and the kinds of visual logics that were produced in order to justify colonization to a larger populace. So not just the kind of stereotypes about black people, the relationships between black Africans in the Congo and the white settlers, the ways that missionaries demonstrate their white superiority. Within the context of this one, for instance, there are scenes where Tintin arrives and takes photographs, and that kind of technical prowess demonstrates a certain kind of European civilization. And so it's very, very embedded in the colonial ideology of the time. And in a way that can't be kind of reduced to he was a product of his time, he was a man of his time, because he was actively producing these, and in fact, many of the artists that were producing these were well aware of also different kinds of visual artistry that was anti-colonial propaganda. So it did exist on some level. And Hergé is someone whose political opinions will change a lot. He has certain albums, he has certain comic books that he renounces. I think Tintin au Pays des Soviets, his one about Soviets from the 1930s, which the artistry is a little sloppy, so I think he has good reason to disown that one. But I'm not sure that he ever disowned this one.
Probably not.
And so it's a good reminder that even if there are things about him and reasons why people want to kind of congratulate him as an artist, that we have to grapple with these political realities of colonization that he was embedded in and involved in and producing in.
Absolutely.
And I wish that we could say, okay, well, it was Hergé, and that's it. Nobody else ever trafficked in visual stereotypes.
Will Eisner.
Right, but of course, I was going to say, you're 100% right, Karen. Will Eisner, we just saw with The Contract of God, he created this hero called the Spirit, and the Spirit had a sidekick with the teeth-gratingly awful name of Ebony White, who is engages in just the same kind of visual stereotyping.
Absolutely.
And it's not Hergé and Eisner only. It's really terribly, really across the board. And so, again, when you teach this, you talk about sort of not only the racist and white supremacist aspects of the time, but also the way in which comics, as an engine of visual stereotyping, can both perpetuate horrible stereotypes and can also try and push back against them at different times too. And part of our history of the medium is trying to see how those negotiations themselves work over the decades and over the century. And so this is something that I think Hergé becomes very interesting about, as Aubrey is talking about that negotiation over Hergé's legacy, about ways in which there have been editing of different books or allowing different ones to be published and not. That's part of the story of one of the features that is the most crucial and the most difficult of comics studies, which is the visual shorthanding that is necessary for that negotiation between reader and artist.
Okay, one more image. Another controversial one. Another controversial artist.
Oh yeah, right.
Not a controversial comic in this case, but a controversial artist.
Yeah. So this is also one of these wonderful plays with time and space that we talked about, and it may be that we're bookending here, right? This is our last image. Yeah. And so this is by Robert Crumb, a name probably that is familiar to many of you if you're interested in comics. Crumb is one of the most influential American comics artists of the 20th century, of the medium, and there is no doubt about that. There is also no doubt about the fact that part of his influence came within a movement and a very active participant that produced taboo-shattering and breaking images, which involved depictions that were pornographic and racist and sexist and every other kind of anti-Semitic, every other kind of ist and ick that you can ick in both senses, I suppose, that you can think of. And as a result, as the decades have gone on, Crumb's influence has become, again, increasingly sort of controversial and negotiated. But it would be, and I find this myself in teaching, it would be impossible to teach a course on the development, certainly of the American comics medium, and perhaps the French, although Aubrey, without taking into account Crumb's legacy as it. And this is something which, as Karen pointed out, is a less controversial example, to put it mildly, but it does put on a display of what you see, what also attracted, which was his incredible draftsmanship. And so overseeing a particular spot, right,
This
over
is
the
called,
course
A Short History of America is the name of this comic.
Yeah. Over the course of this different thing, right, you just see sort of the detail, the perspective, everything that he puts it in. But I think that's enough of an introduction. I mean, I want to hear what other people have to say.
Any thoughts?
Well, I think that might be a good place to take questions.
To open
right?
questions.
Okay.
Let's do that. And I know that Ella has a microphone.
That might be. Where's the
Oh, he's
Okay,
leaving.
okay.
No. Does anybody have a
we
question?
set up the alarm earlier, so just worry.
Oh, right over here, Ella?
I can project.
I think it's for the video, though.
Just wondering if anyone had any particular feelings about Dave Sim, Canadian
Dave
massive
Sim.
work, Cerebus, yeah.
I will say that I actually reached out to him about a decade ago to inquire about his papers, shortly after we'd gotten Wendy and Richard Peeney's papers, because the Peeneys and Dave Sim were kind of the stars of self-publishing at roughly the same time. You can't actually reach out to him. You have to email somebody who knows him, who will relay your message to him, and he will respond to you via fax. So he responded to me via fax in a lengthy kind of polemic about the iniquities of higher education, and ending in something that is a standard element of any communication with Dave Sim, which is he will only have dealings with you if you sign an affidavit attesting that he is not a misogynist, which he is, so that's kind of tricky.
Right.
But, again, a brilliant draftsman, a brilliant storyteller. Cerebus was a staggeringly successful, brilliant thing until it starts to go off the rails. I know Paul Levitz has said that he bought it until it started to get a little squirrely, and then he just, gave up.
Right. I mean, one of the things that, and just for people who don't necessarily know who we're talking about, Dave Sim was a Canadian, or is a Canadian artist, who created what started out as a kind of sword and sorcery parody, where he asked the question that I think all of us have asked at one point or another: what if you took a barbarian sort of world like Dungeons and Dragons or Conan the Barbarian, but made the main character an aardvark? Right, so I'm sure all of us have wondered what would happen.
Pondered.
And the result with Sim was that it became, for a while, a tremendously complex narrative about politics and society, which would also stretch out over many different issues. And this was the second part of Sim's incredible sort of contribution at the time, which was to say, I am going to do something that is going to last 300 issues, right? Come out basically monthly, and then it's going to end. And this was, again, in the early 70s. People did not do this. This was not a thing, right? And he did it. Now, in the process, he devolved into this kind of misogynist, polemicist essayist in the process. The one thing that did not really change was the quality of his art, in which, again, there was this interesting combination, which is, again, very odd for this kind of individualist project, where I don't remember exactly with what issue, but not too long into the process, he gave the backgrounds, these incredibly complicated backgrounds, to another artist, Gerhard. And so it's sort of this incredible partnership that lasted also for a very long time. But and the final thing that I will say, again, for the history of this, was that he realized that what he needed to do, because this was going on for dozens and dozens and then hundreds of issues, was he needed to get people hooked on the earlier issues. And so he would create these collections, which he called phone books, which we would now call sort of protographic novels in some kind of way. And those were sold at a time when you really didn't have these kinds of things. And so he ended up being sort of a major progenitor in saying you can have long, ambitious, serious stories between hardcovers, which we would all, right? So monumentally important to the history of the medium, a monumentally misogynist and difficult character. And part of what we do as academics and historians and scholars is to present all of that to you, right? That's what we do.
Thoughts? Okay. Any other questions? Where's Ella go with the mic? Oh, there you are. How about right in front here?
So regarding it's like the talk about like stereotypes perpetuated by like, comics, both in terms of like their story and like visuals, I recalled like a quote from Alan Moore, like creator of Watchmen, about I think it's like that like the earliest superhero, like that are like often depicted through comics, can be traced back to D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation with the recollection of hoods and capes and like vigilante justice. So in like examples like that, and as well as like his later like disavowal of things like the mainstream like superhero media, as well as adaptations of his own work, like which didn't stop like let's say DC from actually incorporating Watchmen into its own continuity with later issues. Right. It's like it's more of the issue of like how much like if not like. Do you think like it's impossible to like divorce like the idea of like American comics from the ideas of like capitalist realism alongside that like those past of like colonialist or racist stereotypes?
I would say that the trope of the superhero goes farther back than Birth of a Nation, at least to the Scarlet Pimpernel, in which a nobleman disguises himself as actually, a nobleman presents himself as a fop. He's actually a little bit more like Clark Kent and Superman. Presents himself as a fop so that it will distract the French during late 18th century revolution from his going into France as a really tough guy and rescuing all these aristocrats from the guillotine. So of course he's rescuing aristocrats from the revolution, which makes him very much in a kind of conservative posture. But he is absolutely in the trope of the superhero. I'm not sure where Zorro falls chronologically with after Birth of a Nation. No, after. No. I'm talking about with Birth of a Nation. But I think there are tropes of superhero-esque characters who influence the superheroes that were to come that go back farther than the Birth of a Nation. But, you know, there's a lot of ugliness that shows up in all sorts of points in the timeline in comics because it reflects society, and society has a lot of ugliness in it as well.
Yeah, I can like add on to that. It's not like a question, it's more about like the conflict, like its relation to that like existing like the negative aspects of many status quos and paradoxically, along with many marginalized elements for like other visual media is also like quite apparent, especially with like we've got things like animation being often disparaged in American culture until you have like sort of watershed moments or moments of synthesis between comic books and animation, like with Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse among like other creations. Yeah, it's just something like very fascinating.
I have more thoughts, but I'd like to turn it over to my colleagues.
Yeah,
here.
I mean, I don't think it's a counterpoint at all to say that there are different ways of thinking about where that imagery of the superhero comic comes into play. I thought of Fantômas. Certain kinds of pulp fiction at the turn of the century, fin de siècle France. So there's a kind of visual rhetoric of the covers of those, of popular novels and figures in popular culture that also build into a certain kind of site-specific, nation-specific visual culture around superheroes. But I don't think that makes it not the case that those pulp fictions didn't also traffic in certain kinds of racial stereotypes. But the last part of your question was about certain kinds of capitalist ethoses. And I think in some ways, the influential medium argument, you can't have a history of comics without a certain kind of history of capitalism in the publishing industry.
No
And
question.
so there's just no way around it. Yeah, do you want to?
No, I was just saying, I wanted you to finish what you were saying. He was interrupting.
Other questions? I think we can probably take one more. We're going to do one more, Denise. Gentleman in the back. I'm so used to saying like gentlemen and such, and I apologize because I'm old and I'm still stuck in gender norms.
Oh, hi. This one's directed mostly towards Jeremy. Since you mentioned that your next book is going to be an analysis of horror, American horror, I was hoping if you could talk a bit about the connection between comics and the horror genre. Since
Horror
they
genre,
are,
is that what you said?
yeah, since they are inexplicably linked, through. I believe like Creepshow and all the horror magazines, pulp. Yep.
Comics.
Yeah, I mean, I think that. Thank you. I think that one of the things that is famously people talk about when they talk about horror and comics is a period in the early 1950s in which this company primarily called EC, which under the leadership of this guy, Bill Gaines, changed its name to Entertaining Comics, produced all of these comics. The most famous of them are called like Tales from the Crypt and things like that, right? And they were so popular and so disturbing, sort of as the narrative normally goes, that there was this entire Senate hearing that kind of went into shutting them down. The story is more complicated than that. There's a book that I've already recommended twice on the subject if you would like to read it. But I think that one of the things that is equally interesting to me, right, is not only the way in which there are specific comics that traffic in the very conventional, and I mean that not in the sense of boring, but the conventions of horror, vampires or ghosts or Walking Dead or things like that, but the way in which comics, like any other medium, can work with fear. And that can appear both in comics that their main idea is to generate fear, or almost any other aspect of comics. The medical humanities comics that Aubrey talked about before have fear pervading them in every way. Fears about our bodies, fears about them not working, right? All of those kinds of things as well. Superhero comics are predicated on fear. Fear of crime, fear of apocalypse, fear of whatever it is, right? I mean, so one of the things that's interesting to me about your question is that so much of it is that this is a basic emotion that runs through so much of what generates art. And as a result, comics as a medium deals with it as much or as little as any other medium's literature and art does, which is to say, a lot. So you're right to ask it because it really puts everything on the table.
Wonderful, thank you.
Do French comics have a tradition of horror like the American comics? I can't think of them.
I can't think of any either, and these are some larger questions that are, about the differences between the kinds of industries and consumers.
Right.
Right, but I'm just thinking like responses to the war.
Certainly
But
now,
that Tardi, the Tardi we were talking about before.
Yeah.
I mean,
It's
again, it's not a
horrifying.
conventional horror comic.
Right.
No.
But there's horror involved,
yeah.
yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's stop on horror. I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank
Thank you guys.
I want to thank once again the School for Professional Studies, and I think you should absolutely look into the courses that they offer in the summer session because they're cool and awesome. I want to say that there is a little banquet waiting for you in the anteroom, so don't leave right away. And Jeremy and Aubrey and I will linger for a short period of time.
A short period of time, yeah.
They've got kids to get to. I don't. To answer any further questions you might have. So is that good for a closing remark, Denise? All right.
Thank you all.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.